Let me set the scene for you. You've just come home from a long week of school, completely exhausted. You make a beeline for your room, throw your belongings on the floor, and you just completely slump in your chair. Then you find the strength to just boot up your computer, load up the game you're playing with your friends recently, and you feel a rush of second wind come over you. As if out of sheer coincidence, you log on to find all your friends waiting for you. The weekend has truly begun. When we were growing up, we all had that one game, that MMO that we would play with our friends for days on end, hours upon hours. Whether that be World of Warcraft, Life, Club Penguin, they all had a special place in our memories. That game for me was Spiral Knights. In all honesty, Spiral Knights was just like any other typical MMO. You could create your character, or rather, you would create your character. You could collect the gear to then make your character stronger, to then fight the enemies in the dungeons, then get more materials to make your character even more stronger, and the whole cycle would repeat itself. Despite this, me and my friends played this game religiously, always talking about what weapons we were going to make next, what armor sets we would create. Genuinely, thinking back on it now, I just had so much fun playing this game. There would be even days where we would just organize what bosses we were going to fight / farm, so one of us could get a rare weapon to then enhance that. You get the idea. Thinking back on it, or more accurately reminiscing about those days, did get interested to see if the game is A, still alive, and B, if it actually was or is underrated, and if it can hold up to MMOs of today. So let's find out. The premise of this story involves a group of knights that are traveling the galaxy. Unfortunately, during their travels by a certain planet, it causes the ship to malfunction and things start to go the other way. You then are forced to leave in escape pods and you crash land on this mysterious planet. You are then forced to traverse through this wildlife to then encounter the new base of operations on the planet, which is called Haven, funnily enough. During your time on this planet, you will discover its inhabitants, its secrets, its many trials and tribulations, not to mention the many enemies that do anything in their power to stop you at every opportunity they get. In order to solve this mystery of the planet, you must team up with your fellow knights and delve into the clockworks. Then, and only then, would you have a shot at solving the mystery that is this planet. As mentioned previously, Spiral Knights had a simple yet effective gameplay loop. It essentially went like this. You would need to progress through specific tiers, i.e. tiers 1, 2 and 3. This is just giving you a rough example. In order to progress from tier 1 to 2, you would need to collect a certain amount of 2-star equipment to then be qualified to go to the next tier. You would need to have 1 2-star weapon, 1 2-star helmet, 1 2-star armor piece, and then 1 2-star shield. For the weapons, you can actually have an array of them. Well, I say array, but really you only got to pick from a sword, a bomb, and a gun. However, you only needed to have one of the weapons to be essentially relevant to that tier for you to then move on. You didn't need to have the weapons in your arsenal to be that certain tier, since you only could equip 2 weapons. So for example, you can have a 2-star sword, and then you need to have 2-star helmet, 2-star body piece, and then a 2-star shield. That was pretty much the gameplay loop. You'd make the relevant tier of gear, you'd get everything together, and then you would fight whatever you needed to fight, i.e. like a boss or the dungeon. You did pass the test essentially back in the day, and then you'd be able to move on Really, what it was is as soon as you made the gear, you'd then fight your way through the levels, get to a checkpoint in the depths or the clockworks, and then you'd pass through a barrier. It was, yeah, done. Got to pass through the next tier. However, later in the game's lifespan, they decided to put a little twist on that gimmick. You see, it would be too easy for you to just simply craft the gear as is. So for whatever reason, the developers decided to add a few more steps into the crafting process. These 2 steps were the XP needed to level up your weapon, and then orbs of alchemy. Not getting into them too much because it's not too complicated. Essentially, the heat or the experience of your weapon was required to be of a certain level to then craft the gear to the next stage. For example, if you wanted to get your weapon from a 3-star variant to a 4-star variant of that weapon, you would need to get that weapon's experience to level 5 and then have the necessary items, including the orbs of alchemy, to then evolve it into the next star level tier thing. The reason why it made it so long is because you then needed to gather more materials in relation to heat and the orbs of alchemy. The heat wasn't too much of an issue since you can just get that by normally playing the game and going into the levels and then grinding the necessary materials. It might be a bit of a chore later on, since the higher your weapon in terms of rarity, so the stars it has, so for example a 5-star weapon, it takes a lot longer to level up, so it becomes more of a investment to put into your weapon. The funny thing with the heat as it is that you need to then increase the level once it reaches its maximum amount of that stage. So for example, your heat would be from level 1 to the max of level 1. So once you've maxed out for that level, you then use the items in relation to the heat or heat crystal to then evolve it to the next level. This, again, not much of a problem, but it's just more of a hassle kind of thing when it gets to the later end game. Add on that or pair that with the orbs of alchemy, which in reality is more of a money sink. It's just another way to just get you to spend more money on your weapons. It's not the most enjoyable thing. Yes, you can actually get orbs of alchemy within the game, but their drop rates are really not that great. They're pretty low for items that you need for literally all of your gear. You always need orbs of alchemy to evolve your gear to the next stage. Not to mention that even if you wanted to buy them on the in-game market or market board, or however you will, it is not really cheap. Sometimes they can be expensive at the best of times, and when the prices are fluctuating quite often in Spiral Knights, it really is just not fun to want to make a lot of weapons. So it does limit you to make just a few weapons, so you don't spend quite a lot of time continuously farming the same thing, which in and of itself is also a problem for crafting weapons. If you are in the middle tier of the game, or let's say mid game, I would argue that's the most expensive it's gonna get for you, since you don't have an effective means to grind a lot of in-game currency at a rapid rate. That can happen when you're at the end game, but at the middle game you just can't do that. It's quite slow, bit of a slog fest, very lethargic. Just doesn't exactly feel like you're playing a good game. It's just very, very long, which I could expect a lot of people to stop playing at that point, the middle point. But honestly, they made this change for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. I'm guessing they made these changes due to the energy changes they made in the past. When the game came out, and for a while I believe, you needed to actually use energy per floor when you were going to the dungeons or the clockworks of the game. You only could explore daily maximum 10 floors because you'd have a cap of 100 energy that regenerates over time. It took about 24 hours to get all of your energy back. You could buy some more energy with in-game currency, as I've said before, but again, the prices fluctuate, and in the mid game you need to grind a certain amount, which I already said doesn't get you a lot of money, so there's a lot of waiting time. Could say that before the update it was a lot of waiting game, took longer to grind. This is still, it takes longer to grind. I've seen they've balanced it out with you spending more money, so you need to grind more money to then balance out the fact that you now don't need to pay to then play the game. It's more of a pick your poison kind of thing, or the lesser evil. They're still both not that great options in my opinion. That being said, when the missions were eventually introduced into the game, they did give you some items that could help you forge or enhance your equipment. Those items being the Orb of Alchemy, items themselves like pieces of armor and some fire crystals to add on. They only ever gave you enough of those items, being the Orbs of Alchemy and the fire crystals, to ascend either 1 or 2 pieces of your armor, which then you need to go get the rest. And only way to actually get the armors you wanted, you need to buy the recipes for them in order to craft them. You would only be given the standard recipes for the standard spiralized armor, which again doesn't look too bad, but when you've seen a lot of the armor pieces in the game, you want to experiment and explore, it starts to cost you a lot of in-game currency, which then loops back into the whole issue of this game becomes a lot more grindy than it needs to be, especially jumping into the end game or lack thereof end game. As said previously, the main method to upgrading your equipment is by going into the depths of the clockworks or the dungeons or levels and fighting many enemies there, or you'll be farming a certain boss at X amount of time, so anywhere from like 5, maybe 10, depending on what boss it is. It really just depends on what tier of that boss is. The lower the tier, the less you have to farm with it, and then the higher the tier, the more you're most likely gonna have to farm for that weapon. It tends to be a case of tier 1 bosses, or I think there's only one tier 1 boss that would give you 2-star weapons. The tier 2 boss gives you 3-star weapons, and the tier 3 boss gives you 4 to 5-star weapons, if I remember correctly. When the game came out, when it released, there was only 3 bosses for you to fight. Again, if I remember correctly, it was only Snarblacks, Jelly King, and Lord Vanaduke. As far as I can remember, it was only the Ramala's twins that were added as a new boss, and then they eventually added the Shadow Layers, which were essentially a harder version of pre-existing bosses. So they were different. It was a lot harder. Essentially, that was the only end game that they had to offer, which was released the same time the game came out in 2011. Yeah, it's not a good look. It is not a good look, because apart from that end game update in 2011, the game was very dry. It didn't get a major update until months or years later, which really only added a few more weapons. There was a gunning update, which gave guns a bit more of a power boost or incentive for you to use guns more over using melee weapons and swords. And other than that, you got a few pets. We got battle sprites that changed the game a tiny bit, but then again, didn't really do anything crazy. And that really was it. There wasn't anything else added in. I double checked. There was just a lot of events that were added in that were already in the game years ago. Essentially your typical Halloween events, your Christmas events. Then there were a lot of microtransactions in the game. Other than that, apart from the events, which is another way to earn pretty powerful items, there really wasn't anything. Even the events had reskins of weapons that are already in the game. And what I thought was generally an underrated game, which I generally still believe is I still believe it's an underrated game in its prime, but now I just don't think it can hold up anymore. Even though the game had painfully slow yet gradual updates and bug fixes and tweaks, it really was the same old Spiral Knights I knew from 2011. Yes, this game is indeed a decade old. It's got some years behind it. I would argue back then Spiral Knights in its prime was, and indeed was, an underrated game. But with all the things that's happened to it now, behind the scenes, the company changing from Sega to, I believe it's Three Rings now, which now I think it's changed again. I'm not too sure. From last time I heard, it might have changed again. Then lack of endgame content, not to mention the abundance of microtransactions. It really has prevented Spiral Knights from becoming much more than what it is today. Compared to MMOs nowadays, I don't imagine it could just hold a candle to them. Back in the day, I genuinely believe it could have been up there with the big shots, but now I could only say Spiral Knights would be picked up by some new players, only to be dropped off shortly after they reach end game. And even then, the end game being Shadow Layers is a bit of a jump from what you have to do before end game. It's quite comfy. You go to the Shadow Layers is kind of hard without like 4 people. Definitely doing it alone is almost like not possible for someone who's just playing the game casually. In conclusion, I would say Spiral Knights had a lot of potential. Unfortunately, it's just fallen short. Time really has not treated this game well, and unfortunately, I would say it's as underrated as I thought it used to be.